Welcome you all to a session with the esteemed colleague of mine from Oxford University, Professor John Day. He is now emeritus, but had long served since 1980 as fellow and tutor at Lady Margaret Hall and in Old Testament studies. And when I went to Germany back in early 2000s, he was a legend in the field, and I then got to meet his students at the big conferences, and they all told me about how wonderful a lecturer he was and how engaging a colleague he has been over the years. He has devoted his life to scholarship in a way that's quite remarkable. Um, he continues to write, has written over 17 books and 75 articles and edited many, many more, and is now continuing to work on a major monumental commentary in the International Critical Commentary series, the ICCC series on Genesis 1 through 11. And it's with that that we are going to be occupied a bit today as Professor Day takes us through some of the leading discoveries that have helped us understand, if not transformed our understanding of these, especially for Christian audiences, I must say, pivotal texts, Genesis 1 through 11. And I give the mic over to you, Professor Day. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. Over the last 200 years or so, our understanding of Genesis 1 to 11 has undergone a radical transformation. These chapters, commonly known as the primeval history, though primeval story would be better, claim to give an account of the creation of the universe and humanity and of the earliest years of human history. For many centuries, it was generally assumed by Jews and Christians that these chapters give us a reliable and accurate historical account. However, over the last 200 years, discoveries in science, biblical criticism, and archaeology mean that we can no longer do so, but must read these chapters from a new perspective. In this lecture, I shall deal with science, biblical criticism, and archaeological discoveries, mainly texts, in that order. And in the final section, I'll try and be a bit more positive and shall argue that it is still possible for religious believers to find value and meaning in these stories today if we see them as akin to parables rather than understanding them as literal history. So my first section is on science. The first and best known way in which the past 2 centuries have transformed our understanding of Genesis 1 to 11 is through scientific discoveries. Thus, a literal reading of the Bible implies that the world is only about 6,000 years old if we follow the Hebrew Masoretic text, traditionally followed by Jews and the Western Church, or 7,000 years old if we follow the Greek Septuagint, traditionally followed by the Eastern Orthodox Church. The reason for the roughly 1,000-year difference in these figures is because of differences in the 2 versions with regard to the years in the genealogies of the pre- and post-exilic, pre- and post-diluvian patriarchs in Genesis 5 and 11. Thus, Jews have traditionally dated the creation to 3,760 BCE, and the Eastern Orthodox Church to about 5,500 BC. However, best known are the calculations of the 17th century Anglican Archbishop of Armagh in Ireland, James Ussher, who calculated that the creation of the world took place in 4004 BCE, more precisely on October the 23rd. This fitted in nicely with Ussher's dating of the birth of Christ precisely 4,000 years later to 4 BCE and the building of Solomon's temple to 1004 BCE. Now, Ussher wrote his work originally in Latin, and you may be amused to learn that my former late colleague, Professor James Barr, a very distinguished scholar, James Barr found that when he came to read the original Latin of Ussher in the Bodleian Library here in Oxford, he found that the pages needed cutting. No one had read the Latin in the previous 300 years, which is rather astonishing, isn't it? Everyone had read the English. Anyway, to get back to my subject. Anyway, we now know that the universe is approximately 13.7 billion years old, not just a few thousand years old. Again, a literal reading of Genesis 1 implies that everything in creation was made in 6 days, whereas we now know things have evolved over thousands and indeed millions of years. And even human beings have evolved from lower forms of life. At one time, attempts were made to reconcile the Bible with scientific data by supposing that the 6 days each actually denoted long periods of time, 6 long periods of time, instead of literal days. But the repeated references to the evening and the morning throughout Genesis 1 imply that the author understood the days to be literal days, as does God's resting on the 7th day, which clearly provided a precedent for the Sabbath day, or Shabbat. But even if we were to suppose that the days denoted long periods, we are still faced by the fact that the order of creation in Genesis 1 does not totally agree with a modern scientific understanding. Thus, for example, in Genesis 1, both the earth and its vegetation are said to be made before the sun and the stars, neither of which is correct. Another old attempt to reconcile Genesis 1 with science was the so-called gap theory, which supposed that there was an enormous period of time somehow hidden in Genesis 1 verse 2 between the original creation of the earth in Genesis 1 verse 1 and its supposed later recreation in Genesis 1 verse 3. This view goes back to the Dutch Arminian theologian Simon Episcopius, whom not many people have heard of, 1583 to 1643. And this view was popularized through the notes in the popular Schofield Reference Bible. But there is no evidence whatsoever for such a supposition, and it still leaves the problem of there being a mere few days for the divine creativity following the supposed gap. Now, those who claim to believe literally in the biblical account of creation rarely seems to be aware that there are actually 2 accounts of creation in Genesis, not just one in Genesis 1, but there's a second in Genesis 2, which has a different order of creation. We shall come to this later when we discuss the impact of biblical criticism on our understanding of Genesis 1 to 11. But the problems created by science are not confined to the creation narratives. Already in the early 19th century, one of the founding fathers of modern geology, Charles Lyell, had pointed out in his Principles of Geology that there was no geological evidence for a universal flood within historical times, such as Genesis 6 to 8 depicts. Attempts to claim that fossils in the rocks were really the remains of creatures left behind by Noah's flood simply fail to take into account the long periods of time that fossils took to accrue. This is not to deny that some local flood in Mesopotamia ultimately lies behind the story of Noah's flood, something that I'll be discussing later in the 3rd section of this lecture. In conclusion, it is clear that we cannot read the Bible as a scientific textbook. Nevertheless, although today we may wish to read it primarily as a theological account rather than a scientific, it still remains the fact that the Bible does presuppose a few primitive scientific ideas. For example, it presumes there is a solid firmament above the earth, some kind of solid blue metallic material, what we call the sky. The Hebrew word for firmament, rakia, implies something solid. Compare the words of Job chapter 38, verse 7, where it's described as hard as a molten mirror. And both the Greek Septuagint translation stereoma and the Latin Vulgate rendering firmamentum also implies something solid. Again, the Bible also presumes that there are waters above this firmament. Compare Psalm 29, verse 10, the Lord sits enthroned over the flood. Now, some of you by this stage are probably wondering why I'm hammering home these points, which are probably obvious to all educated people, such as you attending this lecture here. Though I still hope you've learnt a few things from what I've said already. But we have to face the fact, unhappy though it may be, we have to face the fact that there are still many people in the world, not so many in Europe, I think, who do take the Genesis creation account literally. Thus, a Gallup poll in 2024 amazingly found that as many as 37% of Americans believe that humans in their present form emerged in the past 10,000 years. And 41% of Americans apparently do not believe that humans evolved from non-human life forms. And 30% of Americans believe that the world was created in 6 24-hour periods. But it's not just in America. A 2011 Ipsos poll found that 55% of South Africans do not believe that humans evolved from lower forms of life. And another 2011 Ipsos poll from Brazil revealed that this was true of 47% of Brazilians. So a large job of education still remains to be undertaken. But we have to face the fact that there are some people who are open to being informed of the truth, people who have an open mind and are fundamentalists because they know nothing better. But there are dogmatic fundamentalists who will insist on their belief, whatever the facts. Anyway, I would like to end this section on science by quoting the words of Charles Darwin himself on the very last page of his foundational 1859 book, The Origin of Species. Speaking of the evolution of the higher animals, Darwin wrote, and I quote, "There is a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone circling on according to a fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved." Now you will see that this passage, the last sentence of The Origin of Species, the famous book, it's clear that Darwin still believed in a creator God when he wrote, as he mentions that. But you may be surprised to learn that Darwin originally went up to Christ's College, Cambridge to read theology, intending to be ordained. And I can't help resist saying that Christ's College, Cambridge was actually my college at Cambridge, and they actually won the University Challenge in the last few days. It was on TV if you watched it on Monday night. Christ's College, Cambridge won the University Challenge. So I'm very proud of my former college. Anyway, I must get back to the subject. The second section is about biblical criticism. The second way in which our understanding of Genesis 1 to 11 has been transformed in the last 200 years has been through biblical criticism. It is now generally agreed that the Pentateuch or Torah is not a literary unity written by one man, Moses, as Christians and Jews assumed for hundreds of years, but is rather a composition made up of several sources that grew up over time and were finally put together by an editor, or what biblical scholars like to call a redactor. For some reason, biblical scholars like using foreign-sounding words when they can. You like Zitzim Laban, and here you have redactor, whereas editor is a more normal English word to use, I think. Anyway, within Genesis 1 to 11, it is clear that there are two main sources, traditionally called the priestly source, or P, and the non-priestly or Yahwistic source, or J. Already in the Middle Ages, the noted 12th century Jewish rabbinic commentator Ibn Ezra questioned whether Moses could have written all of the Pentateuch, especially the account of his own death. But a significant advance took place in 1753 when Jean Astruc, amateur biblical scholar and personal physician to the French King Louis XV and later Louis XVI, wrote a book identifying sources in Genesis on the basis of whether they used the name Yahweh or Elohim for God. Now, in our English Bibles, Yahweh is usually rendered as the Lord in capital letters, and God and Elohim is usually rendered as God in our English Bibles. Now, this is still widely accepted by most as one way in which sources can be distinguished. There are also others, for example, the Hebrew language used, the style, and the theology. Now, Astruc thought that it was Moses himself who made use of these earlier sources in his 1753 book. But during the course of the 19th century, it came to be accepted that these sources were in fact much later than Moses, and four main sources came to be identified in the Pentateuch: J or the Yahwist, E or the Elohist, D or the Deuteronomist, and P or the priestly source in that particular order chronologically, which were later combined by an editor. That was the standard documentary hypothesis view that came to its climax with the German scholar Julius Wellhausen, who gave the documentary hypothesis its classic formulation. Within Genesis 1 to 11, it became generally accepted that only two sources were present, J and P, the Yahwistic or non-priestly source, and the priestly source. And these sources sometimes contain contradictions. Thus, in the seven-day creation account in Genesis 1, the priestly account, human beings, both male and female, are made together at the climax of creation on the sixth day, following inter alia the vegetation. Whereas in Genesis 2 creation account, centered on the Garden of Eden, the man, later called Adam, is made first, then the vegetation, the Garden of Eden, its trees, and finally the woman, later called Eve. When we come to the flood story, here we find that the two accounts have been more or less complete flood stories have been combined a bit like a jigsaw. These two stories often repeat one another, but also contradict one another on occasion. In the J account, the rain comes down for 40 days and 40 nights, whereas in P, the rain, and not only the rain, but also subterranean waters, flood the earth for 150 days. Again in J, seven of every clean and two of every unclean animal enter the ark, while P has just two of every animal coming into the ark. As in the famous song, the animals came in two by two, hurrah, hurrah. So that's based on the priestly version. Coming to the table of nations in Genesis 10, which are presented as the sons of Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, very approximately equivalent to Asia, Africa, and Europe plus Anatolia, we find that the two sources have been conflated, as in the flood story. Some sections start with the words the descendants or sons of X, that's P, while others start with the words X was the father of Y, that's J. Moreover, very interestingly, two of the place names in Genesis 10, Sheba and Havilah, come twice, and one of each is found under each of these two headings, which tends to confirm the composite nature of the table, as well as showing that the editor didn't do his job perfectly. This is one of the conclusions I've come to writing my ICC commentary. I've never seen anyone put it quite like this before, but I think Genesis 1 to 11 tells a number of marvelously told stories, but poorly edited. Now, again, we read in Genesis 6, verse 3, that the future human lifespan is to be reduced to 120 years. But when we come to the second half of the genealogy in Genesis 11, people are still living for several hundred years. This contradiction can be easily explained by the fact that Genesis 6 verse 3 is from J and Genesis 11 genealogies are from P, and the two sources clearly had different concepts of the length of human life at this point. And again, the editor hasn't bothered to sort it all out. As for the distinctive characteristics of J and P you might be wondering about, it should be noted that the priestly source P has a liking for genealogies, the bits of the Bible that many people find are boring. You know, P thought these were the most interesting things, genealogies. And he constantly talks about these are the generations of so-and-so, you know. And also P has a tendency to systematize material, as in Genesis 1, the creation story. You remember the first day, the second day, the third day, etc. P likes organizing things, and he emphasizes the transcendence of God. God just has to say something and it happens, a bit like magic. J, on the other hand, is far more imaginative and writes memorable stories. Think of the stories of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the Tower of Babel, and Cain and Abel, for example. And I've also noticed something that I've never seen anyone point this out. I think the J source has a liking for, you might call, sexy stories. I've never seen any scholarly book mention this, but I think there's something in that. Think of the sons of God and daughters of men incident in Genesis 6, naughty goings on there. Think of story of Noah's nakedness. He becomes drunk and naked in Genesis 9 and Genesis 19. Is it Lot's daughters make him drunk and have sex with him, and they become the ancestors of the Moabites and the Ammonites? So I think Jay's got a bit of a liking for things that are a bit, you know, a bit sexy and a bit odd. Yeah. Now, Jay also has a liking for anthropomorphisms. Think of the Lord walking in the cool of the day in the Garden of Eden. And he has a liking for wordplay, plays on words. For example, Babel, that's Babylon, is said to be so called because there the Lord made a Babel, Hebrew Balal, of the language of all the earth. And I'm going to use that translation in my ICC commentary. It's funny how very few scholars have thought of retaining the wordplay in English, but it's quite easy to do so between Babel and Babel, even more so in American, but you say Babel anyway, don't you, for the tower. And Jay also has a liking for etiologies, stories explaining the origin of things. For example, the discovery of wine, and the origin of many languages, and many other things. I will end this section by noting that in recent decades, especially in Germany, some scholars have questioned the documentary hypothesis of the Pentateuch. They do not deny that the Pentateuch is composite, but though they don't seem to be able to agree on what exactly to put in place of the documentary hypothesis, I've noticed. There are some who think that P is not an independent source, but simply the overall final editor of the Pentateuch. On the other hand, there seem to be others who think that J, or a part of J, is a post-P redactor rather than earlier independent source. Both views seem implausible to me. If you take the flood story, you'll find that we have two virtually complete accounts. So it's very difficult to think that one is simply editing the other because they're both pretty full accounts. And to see J, or part of J, as a post-P redactor seems to be incredible. So there are clear signs that the language of J is earlier than P. I won't give you a whole lecture on this, but I could. But for example, J has a preference for the earlier word for I, Anochi, whereas P always uses the later form Ani, which became regular in the post-exilic period. And J, interestingly, occasionally uses the archaic form of the third person singular masculine possessive suffix in hey, which you find in the Moabite stone, for example, centuries earlier. And this never comes in P. And a strong argument can also be made that J's content is more primitive than P's, but I see time is getting on, so I better get on to my third section, archaeology and the ancient Near Eastern background. The third way in which our understanding of Genesis 1 to 11 has been greatly transformed in the last 2 centuries has been the result of archaeological discoveries, more particularly through the discovery of ancient Near Eastern texts. Previously, the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible had appeared like a root out of dry land, with little beyond classical Greek and Latin texts to compare it with. But over the last couple of centuries, a great deal of light has been shed on the background of the Hebrew Bible by discoveries in Egypt, Mesopotamia, that's modern Iraq, Syria, Anatolia, that's Turkey, and Persia or Iran, as well as in Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. As a result, we can now read the Hebrew Bible in its original ancient Near Eastern context. We can see how the Old Testament does not stand alone, and though unique in its monotheism, originally monolitry, it has sometimes transformed ideas, stories, and customs taken over from other ancient Near Eastern peoples. With regard to Genesis 1 to 11, many of the most important discoveries have come from Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. The name Mesopotamia means the land between the 2 rivers, that is, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. Assyria was to the north and Babylonia to the south. Earlier on, the land had been occupied by a non-Semitic people known as the Sumerians, who seem to have been the first inventors of writing in the form of cuneiform script, beating the ancient Egyptians with their hieroglyphics by a whisker of time. The Sumerians got in first. Now, I shall start by discussing the flood story. Now, although there are flood stories all over the world, there is no doubt that the biblical flood story stands closest to the Mesopotamian and is dependent on it, ultimately. Already in antiquity, interestingly, the Jewish historian Josephus saw the story of Noah's Ark as identical to the Mesopotamian flood story. Now, how did Josephus know the Mesopotamian flood story when cuneiform was deciphered 2,000 years later? Well, it's because Josephus had read his Berossus. Berossus was a Babylonian 3rd century BCE writer who passed on Mesopotamian traditions in Greek. Like the biblical story, the flood story preserved by Berossus has a flood hero who, under divine command, escapes the flood with his family in a rectangular-shaped ark, together with animals and birds. He sends out 3 series of birds to see if the waters have subsided. The ark lands in Armenia, which is exactly where Genesis' mountains of Ararat are, and the flood hero offers sacrifice when the flood is over, just as in Genesis. So quite remarkable parallels. Josephus already spotted the similarities 2,000 years ago. However, it was not until the 19th century that the Mesopotamian flood story was first discovered written in cuneiform script. 3 main versions were discovered: the Sumerian flood story, the Gilgamesh epic in tablet 11, and the Atrahasis epic. First to be translated was tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic, which was first read in the British Museum by a young Assyriologist called George Smith, who, believe it or not, when he first read it, was so excited by what he read that he began to undress himself, to the surprise of all those around him. The discovery caused a sensation, and when later that year, 1872, Smith, now fully dressed, announced the discovery to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London, various famous dignitaries were present, including even the Prime Minister, William Gladstone, who was an amateur theologian. Now, I don't think British Prime Ministers have time to attend lectures on biblical archaeology nowadays, but Gladstone was a very energetic man. He used to cut down trees every day, apparently, and full of energy, unlike modern prime ministers, perhaps. Anyway, many scholars assume that it was the Gilgamesh epic version of the flood that lies behind Genesis. However, in my judgment, it is more likely that the biblical flood story is dependent on the version that we find in the Atrahasis epic, where the flood hero is called Atrahasis, rather than on the Gilgamesh epic. And I've actually written an article about this, but I'll just give some of the main reasons I take this view. In the Atrahasis epic, the flood is reported in the third person past tense, in its primeval setting, several generations after the creation, just as in Genesis. Whereas in the Gilgamesh epic, the flood story has been wrenched from its original context and is reported in the first person by the flood hero, here called Utanapishtim, so as to explain to Gilgamesh how he became immortal after the flood. Again, in the Atrahasis epic, but not in Gilgamesh, the god Ea or Enki announces to the flood hero that the flood is going to take place in 7 days' time, which is exactly what we find in the J version in Genesis 7 verse 4. We don't find that in Gilgamesh. In Gilgamesh, the flood does take place 7 days later, but it's not announced to the flood hero that this is what is going to happen. So that's something interestingly distinctive to Atrahasis and J. Moreover, we find that in the Ark tablet, now in the British Museum, discovered by Irving Finkel, which is another form of the Atrahasis epic, certain animals are said to go into the Ark in twos, just as in the priestly flood story in Genesis, but this is not the case in Gilgamesh. Again, in P in Genesis 9, after the flood, God tells Noah to be fruitful and multiply. And as others have noticed, it's attractive to see this as a reaction to Atrahasis, where after the flood, measures are actually taken to cut down the human race, not increase it, because the human race had become too populous. Yet again, this is not in Gilgamesh. The reason why many see Gilgamesh, I quite understand, the reason why many see Gilgamesh as the source of the Genesis flood story is that it reports a series of 3 birds being sent out from the ark, which is a very interesting parallel. However, it needs to be borne in mind that the Gilgamesh flood story follows very closely the version we have in Atrahasis. That's been proved by Geoffrey Tigay and many others. Lots of verbal parallelism. But it so happens that a long section of Atrahasis is broken precisely where the incident with the birds would have taken place. Anyway, we need to note that in taking over the Mesopotamian flood story, Genesis has transformed it. First, it has monotheized it, if I can invent a word to monotheize. First, it has monotheized it so that it is one God, Yahweh, who both brings the flood and delivers the flood hero, whereas in the Mesopotamian version, it's the god Enlil who brings the flood, but another god, Ea, who delivers the flood hero. Again, Genesis has ethicized the Mesopotamian story. Whereas in Atrahasis, Enlil brings the flood because humanity has become too populous and noisy, in Gilgamesh, the flood appears to be simply a whim on the part of the god Enlil. But in the biblical flood story, the flood is a judgment on human sin. Another transformation is that Noah does not ascend to heaven following the flood, unlike all the known Mesopotamian versions. Some think that this the ascension bit has been transferred to Enoch, and I think that's quite a plausible hypothesis. Anyway, as noted earlier, there is no evidence of a universal flood in historical times, but there is, I think, quite a good likelihood that a local flood ultimately lies behind the story of Noah's flood. Why I say this is that the Mesopotamian flood hero was associated with a place in Babylonia called Shuruppak. And it so happens that we have archaeological evidence of a flood at Shuruppak about 2900 or 2800 BCE in the form of a flood deposit. So it's a plausible hypothesis that is this which lies ultimately behind the Mesopotamian flood story, and that's ultimately behind the story of Noah's flood. We can't prove this, but it's a plausible hypothesis. We now turn to the periods before and after Noah's flood. In Genesis 5, the priestly writer gives us a list of 10 generations of patriarchs before the flood, from Adam to Noah, who are noteworthy for their extremely long lives. You might remember Methuselah, who famously lived for 969 years, allegedly. Now, the 7th of these figures, Enoch, was particularly devout and was raised to heaven, and later was hailed as a great seer and visionary. Some of you may not know that there are books of Enoch, 1, 2, and 3 Enoch. They're not in the Apocrypha, they're in what scholars call the pseudepigrapha. And I used to tell my students, this is supposed to be a joke, that the pseudepigrapha are those books which are too apocryphal to get into the Apocrypha. So that's books of 1, 2, and 3 Enoch. Similarly, from Mesopotamia, we possess various versions of the so-called Sumerian king list, which similarly lists 10 or sometimes 8 or 9, even more extremely long kings before the flood, living thousands of years rather than merely hundreds of years, as in Genesis 5. And if you live in Oxford, you can actually see a version of this. We have a version of the Sumerian king list in the Ashmolean Museum in the ancient Near East room. It's called the World Blundell Prism, if you want to see it. Now, significantly, the 7th figure in the Sumerian king list was also a especially noteworthy figure, Enmedu Renki, likewise a visionary and a seer. And interestingly, he was associated with the city of Sippar, the city of the sun god, and this seems to explain the 365 years of life attributed to Enoch in Genesis 5, since 365 is, of course, the number of years in a solar year. Quite clearly, Genesis 5 is ultimately dependent on the antediluvian part of the Sumerian king list. Now, archaeology in Mesopotamia also helps explain things after the flood in the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. You will recall that people wanted to make a name for themselves by building a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Clearly seen as an act of human hubris, God comes down and confused their language so that they could not understand one another, and so work on the tower stopped. And the city was called Babel, that is Babylon, because the Lord made a babel of their language, as I've said earlier. Now, although this etiology of the world's language is clearly quite mythical, we know that languages of the world didn't all start like this. We know that actually there was a very high tower in Babylon called Etemenanke, which was an example of a ziggurat or temple tower. Now, most interestingly, this temple tower, this ziggurat, was built of brick and bitumen. We know this from Babylonian sources, exactly as the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11 verse 3 is described. And it was described as having its top in the heavens, just as was the intention of those building the tower in Genesis 11 verse 4. Coming to the Garden of Eden story, in which humans gained wisdom but not immortality in this world, and a serpent was involved in depriving humanity of this immortality, this too has precedence in Mesopotamian mythology, even though it may be uncertain whether Genesis is directly dependent on them. They're working in the same sphere of ideas. So Gilgamesh was a king of Uruk in Mesopotamia, 2/3 god and 1/3 human, which is why he wasn't immortal. He wasn't totally divine. Now, when his friend Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is overcome with grief and a desire to obtain eternal life, for which he subsequently goes on a search. He eventually finds Utanapishtim, the Mesopotamian flood hero, the only human to have been made immortal, who, after recounting the flood hero, advises Gilgamesh to find and eat the plant of life, which can make one immortal. Now, Gilgamesh eventually finds the plant of life, but unfortunately a snake eats it, and the snake rejuvenates itself instead of Gilgamesh. So in this, there's a parallel with the Garden of Eden story, in that in both there is a plant or tree of life that grants immortality, and in both cases a snake somehow is involved in depriving humans of this immortality. The stories are quite different, but it's not impossible that Genesis has somehow radically reworked the Babylonian myth. The second Mesopotamian myth I wish to mention is the Adapa epic, Adapa. Adapa was the first Mesopotamian sage, the first American sage, and he was instructed by the god Ea to refuse the so-called bread and water of eternal life that the god Anu would offer him, because Ea says they're not genuine. In refusing them, Adapa found he had been deceived, and he and subsequent humanity were deprived of eternal life, even though they possessed wisdom. In this is a parallel with the Garden of Eden story, where the first humans gain wisdom but are deprived of eternal life in this world, and consumption or refusal of food are somehow involved in humanity's fate. the bread and water of life in Adapa, and the fruit of the tree of knowledge in Genesis. Now, this time is going on. I won't say what I was going to say now about Genesis 1, but we'll move on to my final section called Parabolic Truth. Having been pretty negative, you might think, so far, and doing a hatchet job on Genesis 1 to 11, I now propose to say some positive things about how we might see these stories in a sense that makes sense to people today. In the light of the above, you might be wondering whether it's still possible for religious believers to find any meaning in the stories of Genesis 1 to 11. I think it is if we read them not as literal history, but rather as stories akin to parables. Not exactly parables, but akin to parables. Christians will recall that Jesus' favorite method of teaching was through parables, stories which he had constructed to convey a meaning. And we are all conscious that it's possible for great literature to convey a message to us, whatever its historicity. No one imagines that the meaningfulness of Shakespeare's plays, for example, is dependent on how historical they are. So what religious meaning, then, do I think it's possible to find in Genesis 1 to 11? Well, we may begin with the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Now, although the story is completely mythical, it's not historical, I think it does offer a profoundly true picture of human nature. After yielding temptation, the man blames the woman, and the woman blames the serpent. Neither is willing to take responsibility for their actions. How true to human nature this is. Think of politicians. They're always blaming the others for when things go wrong. Adam is the archetypal man. Indeed, the name Adam means man. Now, if we come to the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, Cain kills his brother Abel. Now, this kind of story is all too frequently repeated throughout human history in one form or another. This is the case whether we're thinking on the individual level, where the most common type of murders are apparently crimes of passion within the family, or whether we are thinking of nations, where brother nation too often takes up arms against brother. Think of Ukraine and Russia. They seem to be brother people, or the First World War, the British and the Germans, even their royal families were related, just to give a couple of examples. Next, what of the flood story? If we read it literally, it can strike us, or it strikes me as being a bit too much a story of divine genocide. But read parabolically, it can be seen as highly relevant to our modern age, where human wrongdoing threatens the world with climate change and environmental catastrophe, just as human wrongdoing in the time of Noah is described as leading to the flood. You can see a kind of analogy there. Again, take the Table of the Nations in Genesis 10. Taken literally, it reads like an imaginary fictional genealogy of Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But read parabolically, we can see it as an affirmation of the unity of humanity. All nations are members of one big family. We can see it as affirming. Finally, the story of the Tower of Babel can be seen as reflecting in story form the well-known proverb, pride comes before a fall. Human beings get too big for their boots, seeking to challenge God, but get their comeuppance, or rather come downance, as a result. We have here a depiction of human hubris and its nemesis. I conclude with Genesis 1. At its climax, we read that God made human beings, both men and women, in his image, something reiterated in Genesis 5 and 9. What originally this meant exactly has been much debated. But there can be no doubt that at the very least it contains an affirmation of the dignity of all human beings, and as such it has acted as an inspiration to those working over the years for racial and sexual equality. I seem to remember the late Archbishop Tutu constantly going on about all humans being in the image of God when he attacked apartheid and racism in South Africa. Well, on that note, I'm going to end.
Thank you so much, Professor Day, for this wonderful talk. You have given us a glimpse of what your work on Genesis 1 through 11 and the commentary is going to contain, but you've also given us a lot very concretely. We now see why your students love you as a lecturer, very concretely about how on 3 different fronts, the scientific, the literary, and the archaeological, Genesis 1 through 11 cannot be taken any longer at face value, thus shifting our attention from reading it historically to reading it parabolically, in your words. But my first question is, was it important for these discoveries, these breakthroughs to occur in order for us to grasp the real meaning of these texts? How has the theological interpretation of these texts shifted? I think they've done that dramatically once we start comparing, let's say, the flood story in Mesopotamia to the biblical one. You pointed out one is because of overpopulation, that's the Babylonian, and the biblical is not, be fruitful and multiply is a mandate that it continues after the flood. But before the flood, it's not about overpopulation, it's about corruption and about evil. Those kinds of things have helped us understand the text in a new way that would not have been possible without this critical approach. Maybe you can speak to that briefly.
Well, I would say that traditional Christianity has spoken of the fall. I know this is not a concept that you get so much in Judaism, is it? That Adam and Eve seem being a fall. I mean, it was, it developed to extreme levels by people like St. Augustine, way beyond what Genesis was actually saying. What I was going to say is that certainly for Christians, if they're going to believe in a fall, I think in the light of evolution, they can now no longer believe it was a literal event some 1,000 years ago. It's rather a description of human nature as it is. This is how we are as a result of our animalic origins. It's, I would say, so one has to kind of redefine how one understands the fall, or again, redefines the whole nature of creation. That we have to see, I suppose, whether Jews or Christians or Muslims or anyone, I think we have to see God as perhaps not so perhaps directly involved in creation, in the sense of literally making humans in our final form a few 1,000 years ago, but God has worked more gradually through the forces of nature, just as today probably most people don't. Years ago, I think in the Church of England they used to pray for the weather. Nowadays I suppose people would think the weather is a result of natural forces, and although God is ultimately responsible for everything, there are lots of intermediate causes that we have to take account of. A thing of reading, we have to recognize that parables aren't just in the New Testament, and I know also in rabbinic writings, but we should perhaps read quite a lot of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, in what you might call a parabolic sense, as stories. I think James Barr talked of it as revelation in history, revelation in story rather than revelation in history, quite a lot of it. And that's difficult for some people to get their mind round, because certain people think that if something's not historical, it's a load of rubbish. But they need to appreciate literature and to see that some of the most meaningful things can be told in story form. Anyway, there are a few observations from.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Do you think that also ancient readers would have read these texts differently from the texts, let's say, in the book of Kings or Samuel, where God is not walking among humans, where miracles are not happening all the time, where people don't live for hundreds and hundreds of years, and those kinds of things? Is there already a natural tendency of biblical readers to interpret these texts differently from other texts? And has then the kind of rational scientific reading been, in large part, a response to the Enlightenment critique of the Bible? Kind of the rise of fundamentalism is not
Yeah.
an ancient thing, it's more of a response to scientific critique of these texts.
Well, you are certainly right that certain fundamentalistic developments have been in response to liberal religious views, but and it is also true that I think even in antiquity, there's evidence that some people didn't read the stories totally literally. People like Origen, for example. Um, but I think in general they probably did read the stories literally. I mean, I don't see any much evidence that in the biblical times people didn't, but I mean, we need to find the evidence. But of course, it's certainly the case that there were different ways in which biblical writers perceived creation, aren't there? There were some who thought God had a conflict with a dragon and the sea, which my first book was about in 1985, reprinted in 1920 by Whitford Stock in America.
That's the one that made you a known figure to me.
Yes, that's right. It's gone into paperback. It became very rare. Anyway, and Genesis 1 seems to me to be a demythologization of this. God's creation is just a job of work. So there were some who did think in terms of literal conflict at the time of creation. It'd be good to know how people in biblical times read these.
Well, that's helpful that you point to Josephus. Josephus and other interpreters looking at how they retell the
Yeah,
Genesis 1 through 11 account. Do they make a distinction between the kinds of things that are happening in these kinds of texts of Genesis? It doesn't seem to be the case, right? Josephus reads these texts as if they were just the same on the same
yes.
level as the Book
No,
of
I have
Kings.
noticed reading Josephus, I find him an extremely interesting writer. He does have an apologetic interest. He tries to present the Hebrew stories in a form he thinks that might make more sense to the Greek mind, or the Roman mind. He
Yeah, he does
sometimes
that. Yes.
modifies it a bit and misses
Yeah.
out bits, and there is something of that.
At the top of the hour and we want to conclude, but we don't want to conclude. First of all, before we thank you very much for your appearance here today, and number one, and number two, that we thank also the Oxford Interfaith Forum, and Thea in particular, Dr. Gamlari, what she has done over the years. She was just awarded a major award at the Crest Hollow from the Guru Nanak Interfaith Award, for her work over the years in creating this forum. And she's a biblical scholar and historian, and her research on Georgian Jewry and marginalized religious communities, um, earning the UN World Interfaith Harmony Week Prize, and now this Hofstra University Interfaith Prize, and so forth. We really owe gratitude to you. And maybe you could share with us, I'm saying this, your speech that was delivered by Professor Aaron Kohler, who will be the new Regis Professor of Cambridge. He spoke on your behalf and read your paper. So maybe if you want to send that address out to us in your emails, no pressure, but I think a lot of us would be most appreciative to read that, and above all, most appreciative that you continue this work.
Can I
I wish.
second that? I mean, I'm
Yes.
quite amazed by all the hard work Thea does in organizing all these hundreds of talks. There's one every few days, So I'm full of admiration.
Thank you very much
Thank you
to
very
both.
much. Thank you very much. But
Yeah.
it's you, the contributors and the audience that make the forums very much.
Thank you, Thea. Have a
Thank you
good
very
day,
much.
you all.
Thank you.